Okay, Chapter 2, Part 2, continuing on with the planting of English America in the New World. Now, looking at Virginia, this first successful colony on the part of the English, we can't talk about Virginia without discussing tobacco. Now, in 1612, John Rolfe came to the New World, and he brought with him these very highly coveted tobacco seeds that he'd somehow gotten from the Spanish, who had tried to keep control of this. Now, tobacco is really what is going to save this new colony from obliteration, because if they weren't successful, the Virginia Company of London would have abandoned them. But by planting and curing tobacco, this really saved Virginia. Now, obviously, we know John Rolfe because he would become Pocahontas' husband after the First Anglo-Powhatan War. Now, the reason this is so important is because there was a huge demand back in Europe for this product, and it actually became a cash crop. So very, very quickly, Virginia did nothing other than grow tobacco because they were making money hand over fist. But the other problem with growing only one crop over and over and over is that it eventually destroys the soil. They were not instituting crop rotation. They were not leaving the fields fallow to allow the nutrients to regenerate. So very quickly, Virginia's soil would become ruined, but they weren't going to worry about that simply because they were making so much money. Beyond just making money, this also created a new demand for labor. They needed to bring people in that were willing and able to grow this new cash crop because they couldn't keep up with the demand yet. So in 1619, this marks a new era in American history. 20 African slaves came to Jamestown, Virginia. Now, there is some historical controversy whether or not these were actually slaves or whether they were brought here as indentured servants. Recent historical scholarship is vacillating back and forth whether or not they were slaves, but this does mark the first Africans in what will become the United States of America. So much so that by the end of the 1600s, they accounted for 14% of Virginia's population. Also, very ironically, in 1619, Virginia established the first semi-representative form of government in Virginia, the House of Burgesses. Now, semi meaning only white males over the age of 21 who owned property were able to vote. But compared to elsewhere in this is very revolutionary, and it marks the first form of representative government. But in 1624, James I, the King of England, revoked Virginia's charter simply because, well, number one, he hated tobacco. He thought it was a nasty crop. And number two, he was also suspicious about how much power the House of Burgesses was giving to the people. So he revoked their charter and made them a royal colony, meaning he controlled them through his royal governors. Now, other colonies started to grow and develop in the New World after Virginia, after the success of Virginia at Jamestown that obviously spread out. Now, Maryland became another English colony in 1634. This was founded by the very wealthy Catholic Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore was looking for a safe haven for his wealthy Catholic family to have where they could practice their religion in peace. You know, they were persecuted back in England, so he wanted somewhere for them to go. So he established Maryland on the St. Mary's in the Chesapeake Bay, and he gave massive, massive estates to his rich Catholic family. Now, the problem is that there were poor Protestant farmers living in the surrounding area that had seeped in from the establishment of Virginia. And so what we start to see happening here is this clash between rich English and poor English. And not only is it a class issue, but it's also a religious issue as well. This makes it ripe for rebellion because you have these Protestants that were protesting, obviously, the Catholic Church versus the Catholics. So it's almost this clash on two waves. But once again, just like we saw with Virginia, tobacco really helps Maryland to flourish, particularly using white indentured servants, which we will go into more detail. But essentially, an indentured servant was somebody who was beyond poor back in England, that had nothing that they could do. So they signed on, they sold themselves essentially to somebody for passage to the New World. They agreed to work for a period of time, usually around 7 years, and during that 7 years, they were the property of that person who had paid for their passage. At the end of the 7 years, they were given their freedom, they were given some clothes, and in some very select circumstances, they were given a plot of land. But during that period, they were basic property that had been sold to that person. Also very specific to Maryland is the Act of Toleration, or the Tolerance Act of 1649. This granted religious tolerance to all Christians, meaning Catholics were free to practice their religion, as well as Protestants, giving them somewhat of a religious safe haven. However, if you were Jewish or an atheist, the death penalty awaited for you in Maryland. This is showing you the expansion out from that original settlement and into the rest of Virginia and into Maryland as well. Now, another colony in the New World, the West Indies, also known as the Caribbean. Now remember, the original settlers were looking to settle in India, in the East Indies. So the Caribbean really became known as the West Indies. Now, Spain really controlled the West Indies for the time being. However, Spain was on the decline and England was on the incline. And especially after Spain had to deal with a Dutch rebellion, they controlled the Netherlands at this time, they had to let go of some of their colonies in the Caribbean. Who was waiting but the English to buy it up in 1655? Now, the focus in the West Indies, or the Caribbean, is on sugar. This is very much so their cash crop. This is a rich man's crop simply because to grow sugar and to produce sugar requires a lot of land and a very labor-intensive processing. So only the very, very wealthy could even afford to be sugar growers in the West Indies. But if you could afford to do it, there was a lot of wealth to be made by growing sugar. And in order to grow their sugar and in order to make this profit, they started importing African slaves. Once again, Native American slaves, they died off through the epidemics. They were able to run away and hide amongst the people because they knew the terrain. Africans didn't have that same luxury. They stuck out. They couldn't hide. They didn't know the terrain. And not only that, but they were used to growing sugar because they'd been used in those sugar plantations off the coast of Africa for the last 100 years or so. But in 1661, especially since blacks were starting to outnumber whites about 4-1, these white sugar growers were getting very, very nervous of their African slaves. And so they instituted these slave codes, primarily in Barbados. This is the first codified set of slave codes that says we own you for life. And not only do we own you, but we own your children and their children. There is no hope for escape from slavery for African slaves, which had not always been the case in the past. In the past, I might own you, but your children are free. This is essentially giving all rights to the white people and none to the African Americans that were being imported to the New World. And this obviously would be exported to other parts of the English colonies. Not only this, but we also see non-sugar growers who would come to the Caribbean who wanted to grow other products being pushed out. The land was too valuable, so they were forced to give up their land to the sugar growers and go elsewhere, primarily the Carolinas, and they brought with them their slave code. So this is how we see the expansion of this idea of what slavery means in the Americas. It is now based on race, and I own you for the duration of forever, and your children as well. Now, speaking of the Carolinas, Charles II, who was the king in 1670, gave a land grant to 8 of his favorite friends, who became known as the Lord Proprietors. He gave them this land grant in what would become Carolina. And its original purpose was to grow the food for Barbados. Now, the sugar growers down in Barbados could do nothing but grow sugar. They needed to bring food in from somewhere, so Carolina was supposed to be where they got their food from. And at first in the Carolinas, they did try to use Native American slavery. Working with the local Savannah Indians, they bought and sold other tribes, throughout Carolina and elsewhere. But very quickly they realized that's not going to work as well, like we said before, and especially since rice cultivation becomes their primary staple. With the failure of Native American slavery, we start to see African slaves being imported in as well. So much so that by 1710, African slaves were the majority of the population in Carolina. So we're really starting to see a division in society in Carolina, just like we see elsewhere. This landed gentry, these rich gentlemen, so to speak, who had a lot of the wealth, a lot of the power, focusing themselves around Charlestown, which is today Charleston, South Carolina, compared to the poor farmers on the periphery. Now, the problem in Carolina is that they're very, very close to Spanish Florida, and the Spanish in Florida are obviously angry with the English on two fronts. Number one, they're taking over land that they thought rightfully belonged to them based on that Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494, and number two, the fact that they are Protestant compared to Catholic. So we start to see skirmishes and battles rise up between the English in the Carolinas and the Spanish as well. Now, you say Carolina, but isn't there a North Carolina and South Carolina? Yes, there is today, but it wasn't always the case. North Carolina really rose out of this dissenter group, these religious outcasts that came down from Virginia. These are really squatters. A squatter is somebody who doesn't actually have a legal right to the land, but lives there anyway. So this is really who makes up the initial population of Northern Carolina. Compare that to that landed gentry down in Southern Carolina. Also add in there are geographical features, dense forest, the sea that separates North and South Carolina, so much so that by 1712, the king grants a separate charter to North Carolina to create a separate colony of North Carolina. And working together with South Carolina, they were able to crush the Native American population in both of their respective colonies. So that by 1720, all coastal tribes, all the way from New England in the north down to South Carolina, were completely obliterated. Now, last but not least in the southern colonies is the colony of Georgia, founded in 1733. They were first established as a buffer colony between the rice growers in Carolina and the Spanish down in Florida. Now, James Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia, was given this colony to help protect those growers in the Carolinas, but he really wanted to institute reform when it came to the criminal justice system. He established a debtors colony in Georgia, basically to try to reform these criminals. They had a lot of money pouring in from the crown, basically in order to protect the colony of Carolina so they could continue to supply all that rice and food stuff to the colonies down in Barbados. So with this money, he was able to institute some reform. Now, at first he did to try to have some religious tolerance, giving religious tolerance to all Christians, except for Catholics. He did try to keep African slavery out of Georgia, but that only lasted for so much of a time, and eventually they succumbed to that as well. And so we see in the southern colonies primarily African slavery taking over. Now, these southern colonies, also known as the plantation colonies, do have some commonalities. All of them have some form of a cash crop, namely tobacco, rice, sugar, etc. All of them eventually did use African slavery, Georgia finally succumbing to that after 1750. We do also see some aristocratic landowners all over these colonies, to a lesser extent in North Carolina, to a lesser extent in Georgia, but that aristocracy, that wealthy class, is still there. We see a lack of cities because they're not really focused on growing large cities. Their focus here is on creating large farms where they can grow these cash crops. So they're very, very spread out in these southern colonies. That's going to be very important later on. There is also some religious tolerance all over the southern colonies. Not the same definition, but some religious tolerance. And like we will see with other English colonies in the north, their focus is on expanding into the continent. They want to continue moving inland. And with further growth inward, we see continued contact, and not nice contact, with Native American tribes.